The map in his hands, a crinkled relic from a life he'd barely known, felt heavier than it should. It was a simple thing, really. Lines of contour, depth soundings, a tiny island barely a speck off the mainland coast. But for Dean, it was an anchor, a desperate final attempt to steady himself against the tide of his own grief. The world had gone quiet around him after everything. A profound, suffocating silence had fallen, one that had driven him to this, to an inheritance he'd never sought from a man he'd never truly understood. He needed solitude, a place where the echoes of his past couldn't reach, a blank slate of wind and rock and unforgiving sea. The final leg of the journey began with a ferry, then a smaller private vessel. But before that, there was the border checkpoint. The small, prefabricated structure stood like a sentry against the vast, indifferent ocean. A single uniformed officer, his face weathered by salt and sun, examined Dean's papers with an unnervingly slow deliberation. Dean felt a prickle of discomfort, a sense of being weighed and found wanting, though for what, he couldn't say. The officer's gaze, devoid of curiosity, lingered on the faded photograph of his grandfather, then on Dean's own drawn face. "Going to the old man's place, are you?" The officer grunted, his voice a low rasp, thick with the tang of stale tobacco. Dean merely nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. The officer stamped the documents with a perfunctory thud that echoed in the small space, then waved him through. It was a final bureaucratic severing from the world he knew, a passage into something undefined. The fishing vessel, a squat, sturdy craft named the Cormorant, smelled of brine, diesel, and something else. A faint metallic tang that clung to the air. The skipper, a hulking figure with hands like gnarled roots, didn't speak much, merely pointed to a rusted bench and started the engine. The mainland receded quickly, swallowed by a brooding, pewter-gray sky. Fog, thick and woolen, began to roll in, not from the horizon, but seeming to well up from the water itself, obscuring the boundary between sea and sky. Dean watched it envelop them, a cold, wet embrace that silenced the world. He pressed his face against the spray-streaked glass, trying to pierce the swirling gray, but there was nothing, only the monotonous churn of the propeller and the low thrum of the engine. The small dock was a skeletal affair of rotting timbers, slippery with seaweed. The skipper cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant gull and the rhythmic slap of waves against the pilings. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of decay and salt, a scent so thick it felt like he could chew it. His grandfather's cottage, a squat, gray structure, clung precariously to the cliff face beneath it, its windows like vacant eyes. The path to the cottage was overgrown, nettles and thorny bushes clawing at his trousers. The front door, once painted a cheerful marine blue, was now a peeling, faded ruin. The lock, stiff with rust, groaned in protest before finally yielding. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the grimy windows. He moved through the small rooms, each one a testament to a life lived in isolation. Yellowed newspapers lay scattered on a table, the dates decades old. A half-finished game of solitaire was laid out on a card table, the king of spades still poised for its next move. It was as if his grandfather had simply vanished mid-thought. Here, the walls were lined with nautical charts, not the crisp modern ones he was used to, but hand-drawn maps, intricate and obsessive, depicting depths and currents that seemed to twist into impossible patterns. A floorboard groaned upstairs. Dean froze, his breath catching in his throat. He told himself it was the house settling, the old timbers adjusting to his presence, or perhaps the wind. But the air was still, heavy, and the groan had sounded too deliberate, too much like a sigh. He listened, straining his ears, but heard nothing more than the frantic beat against his ribs. He was alone. He had to be alone. He walked to the window, peering out into the thickening fog. The world beyond the pane was a uniform gray, featureless and menacing. From somewhere far below, beneath the crashing waves, a sound seemed to ripple up, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in the very foundations of the cliff. It wasn't the sea, not really. Dean closed his eyes, clenching his jaw. He clutched it tighter, the paper cool beneath his thumb, a tangible link to a future he hoped might offer some semblance of peace. The journey to the island was a blur of gray sky and churning water. The small, private ferry, a squat vessel named the Solace, cut a lonely furrow through the swells. Dean had been the only passenger. Before boarding, he'd passed through a rudimentary border checkpoint, a corrugated metal shack staffed by a taciturn officer whose eyes, the color of stagnant seawater, had scanned Dean's identification with an unnerving slowness. The officer hadn't spoken much, just grunted once, a sound like shifting gravel, and waved him through. It felt less like a formality, and more like an initiation, a final, unspoken warning before crossing a threshold. His grandfather's cottage clung to the island's northernmost point, a stoic sentinel of gray stone and weathered timber, dwarfed by the towering skeletal lighthouse beside it. The air tasted of salt and something else, damp earth, decaying seaweed, and a peculiar metallic tang that Dean couldn't place. He unlocked the heavy barnacled door, stepping into a silence that swallowed the sound of the wind, leaving only the dull throb of his own pulse. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating a sparse interior filled with the ghosts of forgotten things. Dean spent the first few days in a fog of unpacking and cleaning, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the clamor in his head. He was a cartographer, a man who understood the precise, predictable patterns of the world. He sought order, reason, logic. But the island, he soon learned, seemed to defy all of it. The tides were the first anomaly. Dean had studied the charts, knew the predicted ebb and flow for this stretch of coast. Yet, the sea here seemed to operate on its own, inscrutable rhythm. One afternoon, he watched from the cottage window as the water receded further than any high tide mark suggested, exposing slick, dark rock formations that looked like ancient petrified bones reaching from the deep. Then, hours later, it would surge in with a speed that felt unnatural. The water a churning, hungry gray, clawing at the base of the cliffs with an almost violent intent. The sea was vast, after all, and not every corner of it was perfectly charted. At first, Dean dismissed them as the wind, the constant, mournful wail that swept off the open water. But as the days bled into one another, the sounds grew more distinct, more unsettling. They weren't the familiar howl of a gale, nor the shriek of gulls. These were low, guttural murmurs, like stones grinding together beneath immense pressure, or a voice trying to remember how to form words. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the spray, seeping through the gaps in the old stone walls. He'd pause, straining his ears, convinced he'd almost caught a phrase, a syllable, only for the sound to dissolve back into the general cacophony of the sea. It was exhaustion, he decided, the sheer isolation playing tricks on his auditory cortex. A man alone for too long began to invent company. It was a small, cramped room, heavy with the scent of mildewed paper and stale pipe tobacco. He ran a hand along a built-in shelf, lined with forgotten navigation manuals and weather-beaten almanacs. Behind a stack of charts depicting obscure shipping lanes, his fingers snagged on something. A leather-bound book, swollen with damp, its cover warped like dried kelp. He pulled it free. It was a journal, its pages thick and discolored, many of them stuck together. Dean pried it open carefully, the brittle paper groaning in protest. The script was his grandfather's, sprawling and agitated, often fading into illegibility where water had seeped in. Not maps, not ships, not even the familiar flora and fauna of the island. These were jagged, frantic lines depicting impossible geometries, deep-sea trenches that opened like wounds in the earth, and then, repeated over and over, a symbol that looked like a fractured eye, staring out from impossible depths. Beneath one particularly disturbing sketch, a swirling vortex of dark water from which indistinct, elongated forms seemed to writhe. The ink was smudged, but a phrase stood out, scrawled repeatedly in the margins, sometimes almost illegible. The deep song. It calls. Don't listen. Dean's rationalizations, his careful scaffolding of logic, began to crumble. They were connected, woven into the frantic warnings of a man he'd barely known, a man who had lived and died on this very island. The deep song. It was a name, a warning, and it was undeniably tied to the unsettling melody that now seemed to permeate the very air of the island. He was no longer alone, and the company he now kept was far more ancient and terrifying than any he could have imagined. Dean found himself unable to sleep, the previous night's fragmented memories and his grandfather's desperate scrawl burning behind his eyelids. The fragile fortress of his rationality had been breached. He needed answers, not just for his sanity, but for the gnawing conviction that something genuinely ancient and malevolent was stirring. The determination felt like a cold, sharp blade, cutting through the fog of his grief and isolation. He began with the cottage itself, a forensic examination of his grandfather's last days. The old man's journal, previously a collection of rambling anxieties, now held a terrifying new weight. Dean spread the aged, brittle pages across the sturdy oak table, the scent of dust and dried salt rising from them. He squinted at the faded ink, cross-referencing dates, searching for patterns, for any thread connecting the unusual tides to the escalating madness described in the entries. The whispers grow louder, not just in the wind, but in the currents. They speak of the deep, of what lies dreaming. A bargain struck long ago for safe passage. And now, payment is due. A bargain, a pact. What kind of pact? Who made it? And with what? The few local histories he'd brought with him from the mainland were sparse, focused on fishing yields and the lighthouse's construction. This island, despite its remote location, had a history that felt deliberately obscured. He remembered a small, dusty public archive in the nearest mainland town, accessible by the weekly ferry. The decision made, Dean prepared for the journey. The ferry crossing was always a lonely affair. The gray expanse of water stretching endlessly, the air thick with brine and the mournful cries of gulls. Upon arrival at the mainland port, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The town, a cluster of weathered buildings clinging to the shore, felt watchful. He passed the old, disused border checkpoint on the outskirts of the port, a relic from a time when the island's autonomy had been more fiercely guarded, or perhaps when its resources had been deemed more valuable. The booth was boarded up, paint peeling, its rusted gate leaning precariously. Yet, as he walked past, he felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck, a sense of being observed, even though no one was there. It was a lingering impression, a ghostly sentinel guarding an invisible line. He hurried on, shaking off the unsettling feeling. The archive was a cramped, musty room above a fishmonger's shop, smelling of old paper and brine. A quiet, elderly woman, the town's unofficial historian, presided over stacks of yellowed documents. He regarded Dean with a curious, almost pitying expression when he asked for anything related to the island's ancient history, specifically anything predating the lighthouse. Few cared for what came before the light, he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. But there are stories. Always stories. He pointed him to a shelf laden with forgotten tomes. Their spines cracked and faded, hours blurred into a haze of forgotten names and obscure events. He found it in a collection of local folklore, tucked between accounts of shipwrecks and hardy fishermen. It wasn't explicit, but the implications were stark. The texts spoke of a sunken city, not a metaphorical one, but a literal metropolis beneath the waves, home to beings of immense power. These rites, the stories claimed, involved offerings, sacrifices, and a binding pact to ensure the entity's quiescence, preventing its awakening and the subsequent inundation of the land. The pact, the texts implied, was tenuous, requiring constant vigilance, a generational burden. The lighthouse, Dean suddenly realized, wasn't just a beacon for ships, it was a ward. His grandfather's "Keep the Light Burning" took on a terrifying new dimension. The journal, open on the table, seemed to hum with the newly discovered knowledge. The pact was clearer now. His grandfather hadn't just been warning him about a storm. He'd been warning him about a reckoning. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a release. He dreamed of the sea, but it was not the familiar gray expanse. He tried to scream, but the water filled his lungs, a burning, icy pressure. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the corner of the room, near the old stone hearth. On the damp, uneven flagstones, a patch of strange, iridescent green algae pulsed with a soft, otherworldly light. It wasn't moss. It was something alien, bioluminescent, clinging to the stone as if reaching, stretching. It glowed with the same unsettling luminescence he'd seen in his nightmare. It smelled faintly of decay and something else, something metallic and saline, like a wound open to the sea. The entity wasn't just a legend, not just a distant threat. It was here. It was growing, slowly, silently, inside his home. His world, his carefully constructed reality, was dissolving into the deep. The implications from the forgotten tome clung to Dean like a shroud woven from brine and ancient fear. He had tried to dismiss them, to attribute the strange accounts to the fevered imaginations of isolated islanders, but the words had burrowed deep, whispering of pacts and depths, of things best left undisturbed. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the flickering lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe with a life of their own. The wind outside whined its ceaseless lament, rattling the window panes with a mournful percussion. He reached for his mug of cooling tea, his fingers brushing against its ceramic warmth. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, convinced the fatigue was playing tricks. Had the mug been closer? He distinctly remembered placing it a few inches to his right, near the edge of the table. Now it was almost dead center. A trick of the light, he told himself. Or perhaps he was simply more tired than he thought. He pushed it back to its original spot with a dismissive grunt. A low thrum began then, subtle at first. A vibration felt more in his bones than heard by his ears. It was like the deep, resonant hum of a distant engine. Yet there was no engine, no boat nearby. It wasn't the wind, which he knew intimately now, nor the creaking of the old cottage. This was deeper, more fundamental, a frequency that seemed to bypass his auditory canals and vibrate directly within his chest cavity, making his teeth ache. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound, or rather the feeling of it, persisted, a relentless, hypnotic drone that permeated the very air. It felt like the island itself was breathing, a slow, titanic exhalation from the depths. He stood, pacing the small living area, trying to locate the source. He pressed an ear to the wall, then to the floorboards. Nothing. It was everywhere and nowhere, a disorienting, omnipresent pulse. The air grew heavy, thick with a damp, metallic scent he couldn't quite place, like old pennies and stagnant seawater. Catching his breath, he glanced towards the tall, narrow mirror above the mantelpiece, a relic his grandfather must have kept. But as he watched, a ripple seemed to pass over the glass, not on the surface, but within it. His features elongated for a fleeting instant, his jawline stretching, his eyes widening into distorted pools. A faint greenish tint, like light filtered through deep water, washed over the image before receding. He blinked, hard, and the mirror showed only his ordinary, tired face, the glass perfectly still. It was too quick, too subtle to be real, surely. His mind was playing tricks, succumbing to the isolation and the strange tales. But the hum intensified. A deeper resonance now, a growing pressure in his skull. Something was here. Driven by a sudden, frantic need for answers, Dean began to search the cottage with renewed intensity. He wasn't just tidying anymore. He was hunting for clues, for anything his grandfather might have left behind. He tore through drawers, emptied dusty chests, his fingers brushing against forgotten relics of a life lived in solitude. Under a loose floorboard in the master bedroom, a spot his grandfather had often stood, he found a small wooden box, crudely carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Jagged lines, spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward, an image that resembled a twisted, many-tentacled form, resembling a tiny, monstrous fish. It wasn't a natural death, he felt. This was an offering, a ward, or perhaps even a sacrifice. His grandfather hadn't just lived here. He had been engaged in some desperate, silent war. The hum pulsed, now almost a physical force, vibrating the very floorboards beneath his feet. He spun around, his breath catching, his eyes darting through the gloom. It wasn't solid, not quite. It wavered, indistinct, yet undeniably present. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the hum, a silent, predatory beat. Dean stumbled back, his spine hitting the rough plaster wall with a jarring thud. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the insistent thrum of the entity. It wasn't a hand, not a limb, but a part of that vast, formless thing, extending, seeking. A primal scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate. He scrambled sideways, tripping over a rug, sending a chair clattering to the floor. The sound, sharp and sudden, seemed to break the spell. He gasped, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead, his body trembling violently. It was real. All of it. The folklore, the hum, the distorted reflection, his grandfather's desperate wards. It was all terrifyingly, undeniably real. He was no longer just an observer, an inheritor of a lonely cottage. He was caught in something ancient, something that had awakened, and it had finally shown itself. The thought of escape, of leaving this accursed island, flashed through his mind like a desperate beacon. The only way off was through the small, weather-beaten border checkpoint down by the single barnacle-encrusted dock. How could he explain this? Who would believe him? The entity was here, in the cottage, on the island, and he was trapped. Now a cold, hard resolve settled in his gut. Dismissal was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had to know. He returned to the journal, its leather binding cracked, its pages brittle beneath his fingertips. He traced the frantic script, his grandfather's hand growing less steady with each passing year recorded. The early entries were meticulous, the observations of a dedicated lighthouse keeper. But as the pages turned, a shift occurred. The scientific detachment gave way to something else. A desperate, almost devotional tone. Dean's breath hitched. His grandfather hadn't just been observing. He had been participating. The journal began to detail routines, not just of lighthouse maintenance, but of specific dates, specific tides, specific offerings. Crude drawings of symbols, vaguely familiar from the deeper recesses of the ancient tome, now appeared alongside notes about the sea's temperament, the moon's phase, and the required tributes. His grandfather had been a guardian, yes, but not of the light for passing ships. His grandfather had not been a victim, but an active participant in keeping the entity dormant. The air in the study thickened. A low thrum, barely perceptible at first, began to vibrate through the floorboards, through the very bones of the cottage. It was a pressure, a subtle hum that made the edges of his vision waver. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the faint shimmering at the periphery persisted, like heat haze off an unseen ocean. He read of desperate pleas, of sacrifices made to appease the Deep One. His grandfather's entries grew more fragmented, more frantic, detailing journeys to a specific, desolate stretch of the island's northern shore. For the transfer of things. The raw materials for the rituals, the ancient objects, the offerings. His grandfather had considered it a threshold, a gate between the mundane world and the deeper, ritualistic one. A place where the pact was acknowledged before the true work began back at the lighthouse. It pressed in, a physical weight. He saw his own reflection in the window pane, distorted, stretched, the lamplight making his face seem gaunt, his eyes too wide. He glanced away, startled by the stranger staring back. A faint, cloying scent, like decay mixed with wet rock and something indescribably ancient, began to permeate the study. It clung to the old books, to the worn armchair, to his own clothes. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt dry, his tongue thick. Was it real? The journal's final entries were barely legible, scrawled in a hand that trembled with fear or madness, or both. They spoke of a final, desperate measure, a mechanism to ensure the slumber remained unbroken, a place of containment directly beneath the lighthouse. The words were vague, cryptic, hinting at a hidden chamber, a crypt, built into the very foundations, designed to amplify the ritual's power. Dean's eyes darted around the study, then down. The floorboards, old and groaning, felt solid beneath his feet, but a new understanding had taken root. He remembered a subtle difference in the stone beneath the central pillar of the lighthouse, a faint seam he had dismissed as simple wear and tear. He pushed himself up from the desk, the deep song now a roaring current in his mind, drowning out the sound of the wind, the crash of the waves. He moved through the cottage, his steps deliberate, drawn by an invisible thread. The scent of brine and decay was stronger here, a palpable presence. He ran his hand along the rough-hewn granite, searching, feeling for any anomaly. His fingers brushed against a section of the wall near the central spiral staircase. It was subtly different, the stone smoother, the mortar lines too precise. A faint indentation, barely visible, caught his eye. He pressed it. With a low groan that echoed the deep song, a section of the stone wall slid inwards, then rotated slowly, revealing a narrow, gaping blackness. The deep song surged, a crescendo of ancient power that clawed at the walls of his sanity. Below, a rough-hewn flight of steps descended into the earth, into the unknown, into his grandfather's terrible legacy. The words of the forgotten tome had etched themselves onto Dean's mind, not as ink on brittle parchment, but as a creeping frost across his very marrow. He had dismissed them, tried to, but the whispers of pacts and depths, of things best left undisturbed, had woven themselves into the fabric of his solitude. Now he understood. Or, at least, he was about to. A grim resolve, cold and hard as the sea-smoothed stones along the shore, propelled him forward. They were harbingers. His trek took him inland, away from the familiar paths to the lighthouse, towards a forgotten, overgrown track that snaked around the island's highest bluffs. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, an underlying metallic tang he couldn't quite place. He pushed through a tangle of thorny gorse bushes, their needles tearing at his oilskin, and emerged into a small, bleak clearing. Before him stood the border checkpoint. It wasn't a grand structure, merely a squat concrete blockhouse, its windows long shattered, its heavy steel door rusted shut and half buried in encroaching soil. A relic from a past attempt to control access to this remote corner of the island, perhaps during a forgotten war or a quarantine. It had stood abandoned for decades, a monument to a forgotten authority. Dean had passed it countless times, always dismissing it as another crumbling piece of the island's neglect. Now he saw it differently. The tome had hinted at a passage, a gateway, hidden in plain sight, guarded by a symbolic barrier. The concrete walls were scarred with deep gouges, as if something immense had scraped against them, leaving trails of pulverized aggregate. Behind it, partially obscured by a thicket of stunted, wind-blasted trees, he found it. Not a door, but a fissure in the rock face, barely wider than his shoulders, disguised by a clever arrangement of loose stones and overgrown ivy. He pulled away the stones, the grating sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. He switched on his lantern, its beam swallowed almost immediately by the profound blackness. Taking a deep breath, the determination in his chest warring with a rising tide of primal fear, Dean squeezed through the opening. The passage sloped sharply downwards, the rough-hewn rock walls pressing in on him. Each step sent grit skittering into the unseen depths. The ozone smell intensified, mingling now with a saline, coppery odor. He descended for what felt like an eternity, the beam of his lantern bobbing wildly, painting fleeting specters on the damp stone. He felt utterly alone, yet intensely observed, as if the very rock around him had eyes. Then, the passage opened. He found himself in a vast subterranean chamber, carved not by human hands, but by the relentless, patient work of eons. In the center of the chamber, resting on a natural pedestal of obsidian-like stone, was the artifact. It wasn't metal, nor stone, nor anything Dean could readily identify. It was organic, yet impossibly geometric, a pulsating mass of iridescent obsidian-black material, roughly spherical but constantly shifting its contours. Dean approached, his boots scraping on the cavern floor, the sound swallowed by the artifact's omnipresent thrum. The object seemed to draw the light from his lantern, dimming its beam as he neared. He could feel its presence, a vast, ancient awareness that stretched beyond comprehension. The artifact pulsed brighter, its cerulean light flaring, and then Dean's reality shattered. He was no longer in the chamber. He was everywhere and nowhere. It was a place of impossible scale, where colossal forms, shapeless and vast, drifted in an eternal, lightless drift. The entity's true nature was revealed to him then. Not a monster with teeth and claws, but an ancient, indifferent intelligence, a fundamental force of the deep, older than mountains, older than light. It was the primordial chaos made manifest, a vast, unknowable consciousness that simply was. Its existence was a slow, inevitable tide, eroding reality itself. He witnessed a vision, stark and terrifying. The island, his home, dissolving into a shimmering, gelatinous mass, the lighthouse crumbling like a sandcastle under an advancing wave. The entity sought not to destroy, but to reclaim, to pull everything into its primordial domain, to return the world to its original, formless state. His sanity frayed at the edges, stretched taut by the sheer, unfathomable scale of it all. The immediate threat was not just to his life, but to his very being, to the fabric of existence. The entity was stirring, and the island was its chosen point of entry. Dean gasped, a soundless cry tearing from his throat, and stumbled backward, away from the pulsating artifact. He had seen. He now knew. And the knowledge was a poison, seeping into every corner of his mind. The world outside the cottage had become a churning, indistinguishable gray, a solid wall of fog pressed against the windows. But Dean knew the real storm raged within. The words of the ancient tome, once a distant echo, now clawed at the walls of his mind. Not just whispers, but a guttural, resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth. It was as if something immense had pressed itself against the thin membrane of his reality, a vast, unseen weight seeking purchase. He stumbled back from the desk, knocking over the rickety chair. The sound, sharp and sudden, only seemed to intensify the internal pressure. This was an active, malevolent will. A phantom touch, icy and wet, grazed the inside of his skull, a sensation so violating it made him gag. It wasn't merely trying to frighten him, it was trying to enter, to possess, to break him open like a brittle shell. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, fighting for breath that seemed thin and insufficient. "It seeks a vessel," one entry read, "a bridge across the threshold, and the island yields easily to its hunger." Dean was the only one left on the island. He was the vessel. He would not yield. He could not. His eyes, stinging with unshed tears and exhaustion, darted across the faded script, searching, pleading for an answer. He flipped through pages describing the island's geology, the patterns of the tides, the history of the lighthouse, mundane details that now seemed like a cruel mockery. The hum intensified, a low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards, vibrating up through his feet. He could almost taste the brine and decay in the air, a phantom stench that was not of the sea, but of something far older, far fouler. His gaze snagged on a series of heavily underlined passages, almost obscured by time and clumsy crossouts. It spoke of wards, of seals, of ancient pacts, and of a means to return what had been awakened. His fingers traced the faded words, his mind struggling to piece together the fragmented instructions. It wasn't a ritual in the traditional sense, not with incantations and elaborate gestures. He saw references to specific geographical points on the island, landmarks that would act as anchors, and a final, crucial step. The words blurred, his vision swimming, but the core message began to solidify, horrifying in its clarity. To seal the portal, to sever the tether it had established, required a terrible sacrifice. It wasn't blood, not exactly. It wasn't his life it demanded, not directly. It demanded his connection to what he held dearest, to the very memories that defined him, that anchored him to the world before this nightmare. It would destroy the very essence of who Dean was, the man haunted by loss, but still capable of love. It was a sacrifice of self, of soul. The thought was a searing brand. He would lose everything, even the pain that had become a grim companion, a constant reminder of what he had lost. But the alternative, that was a fate worse than any profound loss. A sudden, jarring shift in the air, a pressure drop so acute his ears popped, made him gasp. The hum intensified, now a high-pitched whine that scraped against his teeth. It knew. It sensed his discovery, his desperate plan. It was pushing harder, trying to overwhelm him before he could act. The ritual, if it could be called that, had to be performed at a specific point, a convergence of the island's ancient ley lines. A place the grandfather had simply called the Threshold. Dean knew the location from his cartographic studies of the island, a jagged promontory on the far side, overlooking a treacherous stretch of sea. It was the island's true border checkpoint, the point beyond which the land gave way entirely to the deep, the last bastion of solid ground before the ocean's untamed expanse. It was where the veil between worlds was thinnest and where the entity's power was strongest. Even if it meant leaving him an empty vessel, devoid of the very memories that defined him, it was a choice. It was a fight. And Dean, trapped and terrified, felt a steel resolve harden in his core. He would make the terrible sacrifice. He would face the true border checkpoint. The guttural, resonant sound was no longer a phantom echo. It vibrated through the very floorboards of the cottage, a low thrumming that settled deep in Dean's bones, a physical ache behind his eyes. It was the sound of a vast, ancient hunger, now fully awake, fully present. The world outside the windows, already a churning gray, began to shift. The solid wall of fog pressed inward, not just visually, but almost tangibly, as if trying to force its way through the glass. A suffocating presence. Images flickered. Crushing depths, black water, things with too many eyes. Dean pressed his hands against his temples, fighting the invasion, the cold sweat slicking his skin. A faint, cloying scent, like dead kelp and something metallic, permeated the air, thick and nauseating. The grass, normally a resilient green, was now a sickly pale gray, studded with bulbous, glistening growths that pulsed with a faint internal light. The island itself was becoming a nightmare tableau, a canvas for the entity's burgeoning power. This was it, the final desperate gamble. But the cost? He'd pushed that thought away, buried it under layers of fear and grim determination. Now it demanded his attention. He ran a trembling finger over the last faded entry. The words blurred, then sharpened, coalescing into a horrifying clarity. The counter-ritual wasn't merely a banishment. It was a trade. A part of him, a fundamental piece, would be offered as an anchor, a tether to hold the entity down. Not his life, not directly, but something far more insidious. His memories. Specifically, the memories of his profound personal tragedy, the very reason he'd sought this desolate solitude. The weight of that loss, the raw wound that had defined his existence since, would be consumed, used as the binding force. He would be free of the pain, yes, but also free of the memory of what caused it. He would forget. Could he choose oblivion, even if it meant saving the island, saving what remained of his sanity? He had come here to escape his pain, not to erase the very source of it. But the guttural thrumming intensified, rattling the very plates in the cupboard, and the decision was made for him. The island would not survive otherwise, and neither would he. With a desperate resolve hardening his features, Dean grabbed the journal, tucking it into the oilskin satchel he'd prepared. He retrieved the collection of odd items his grandfather had meticulously described. A shard of obsidian, a length of braided seaweed, a small, intricate carving of a seabird, worn smooth by generations of handling. Each object felt charged, humming with an ancient energy. The air grew heavy, laden with moisture, and the metallic tang became almost suffocating. As he opened the front door, the wind shrieked, a sound like 1,000 voices screaming, and a deluge of unnaturally thick, oily rain lashed down, stinging his exposed skin. The light from the cottage spilled out for a moment, illuminating the warped landscape, the twisted trees, the pulsating growths in the garden, the churning sea beyond the cliff face. Now a boiling cauldron of black foam. His path led him along the treacherous cliff edge, the ground soft and treacherous underfoot. He hugged the cliff face, his fingers raw from gripping the damp, craggy rock. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decay, and the guttural thrumming was louder here, resonating from the very depths of the ocean. A jagged, natural archway of black rock, barely visible through the torrential downpour and the suffocating fog. It stood on a narrow spit of land, flanked by 2 ancient, moss-covered monoliths that leaned precariously inward, like the gates of some forgotten domain. This was the border checkpoint his grandfather had mentioned in the journal, the threshold to the place where the entity's power was strongest, where the ritual could be enacted. The rain ceased, but the ground remained slick, covered in a strange, iridescent slime that shimmered faintly in the gloom. He was truly alone here, utterly exposed. He looked back, but the archway was already swallowed by the fog, the path he'd taken erased. There was no turning back, only forward into the heart of the storm, into the waiting maw of oblivion. The world outside the window had dissolved into a maelstrom of churning gray. Fog, thick and greasy, pressed against the glass, not just obscuring the view, but seeming to absorb the light, drawing it into its suffocating depths. His grandfather's frantic, scrawled notes were a map to damnation, but also, perhaps, to salvation. The ritual, glimpsed in cryptic verses, was a desperate gamble. Stepping out of the cottage was like plunging into a frigid, living entity. The wind tore at his clothes. a shriek that drowned out even the thrumming in the earth. The air tasted of salt, iron, and something else. A deep-sea rot, an ancient, unimaginable decay that made his stomach clench. He squinted through the swirling vapor, the lighthouse a towering spectral silhouette, its beam struggling, stuttering, then dying completely. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to lance through him, but Dean pushed it down. Determination, forged in the crucible of loss and the chilling certainty of the island's secret, was all he had left. The path to the lighthouse was no longer solid ground. It buckled and shifted beneath his boots, a spongy, yielding surface that felt like decaying flesh. Water, black and viscous, surged up from unseen fissures, swirling around his ankles, carrying with it strange, pulpy masses that bumped against his legs. The fog writhed, forming momentary, impossible shapes. Colossal, undulating tendrils, then dissolving into a featureless gray. He reached the lighthouse door, a heavy, barnacled slab of oak. It stood ajar, groaning on rusted hinges. The air was thick, wet, and tasted of brine and fear. Each step upward was a fight against an unseen current, a gravitational pull that seemed to shift and waver. The stone walls, once solid and reassuring, now seemed to ripple, the mortar between the blocks pulsing faintly. Then he saw it. Halfway up the ascent, where a landing should have been, the staircase abruptly terminated in a structure that made no sense. It was a bizarre amalgamation of calcified bone-like material and rusted, corroded metal, forming a grotesque booth. A single flickering lantern, not quite casting light, hung above it. This was no part of the lighthouse Dean had explored. This was the border checkpoint. A figure stood behind the booth. It was a projection, a fragment of the entity's will, designed to impede, to break. It extended a long, multi-jointed limb, not quite a hand, and pointed to a space before the booth. Passage requires identity, memory, self. The entity's presence pressed down, trying to pry open his mind, to snatch away the very essence of who he was. It was trying to drown him in his past, to make him surrender. He clutched the journal tighter, the rough leather digging into his palm. "No," he said, his voice stronger now, a defiant tremor. "You won't have it." He had already lost so much. He would not lose himself. He pushed past the invisible barrier, the air around him thickening, resisting, as if he were wading through syrup. The checkpoint vanished behind him, leaving only the impossible ascent. He reached the top, the lantern room, where the great lamp should have been. It pulsed with a terrible silent energy, drawing in the remaining light, the very air, threatening to consume him. This was it. The source of the hunger. The gateway. He pulled the ancient chart from the journal. It depicted a complex sigil, a binding rune, surrounded by strange, unreadable symbols. His grandfather's final, desperate note was stark. The seal demands a true anchor, a keeper, a sacrifice of self to become the barrier. Dean understood. The entity didn't just want a sacrifice. It wanted him to become the sacrifice, to be bound to the seal, to become a living part of the prison. His grandfather had tried, failed, and perhaps fled. Dean would not. He was tired of running. He was tired of the grief, the emptiness. This was a chance to finally, truly do something. The symbols on the paper began to glow, a faint phosphorescent blue. Now, keeper. He pricked his thumb on the compass's brass casing, a sharp, clean pain. Pressed the droplet of blood onto the center of the glowing sigil. The vortex roared, a soundless internal scream that tore at the edges of his mind. He felt his consciousness fraying, his memories scattering like dust. Visions of his life, his lost loved one, flickered, then began to fade. He pushed back, pouring every ounce of his will, his grief, his determined defiance into the ritual. He focused on the sigil, on the binding. The entity shrieked, a psychic assault that threatened to shatter his mind. He felt his connection to the world, to his own identity, stretching, thinning, fraying. But the blue light held. It expanded, encompassing the entire lantern room, pushing back the black tendrils, forcing the vortex to shrink, to recede. The sound of the thrumming began to lessen, replaced by a low, resonant hum of containment. The portal, though still visible as a faint shimmer, was closing. The entity was being forced back. He was still standing, but he felt different. Lighter, yet heavier. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was something else now. He was the keeper. And the sacrifice. The deep song pulsed, no longer a whisper in his mind, but a resonant thrum against his very bones. It vibrated through the ancient stones of the lighthouse, a low, guttural chant that promised an end to all things. Dean stood at the precipice, the trapdoor to the abyssal shaft open, the chill rising from below a tangible, hungry presence. He saw it now, not just with his eyes, but with a deeper internal vision. The interwoven energies, the lines of force that held the ancient seal. His grandfather's frantic scrawlings, once a madman's ravings, were a map, a desperate instruction manual. He was tired of running. He was tired of the grief, the emptiness that had hollowed him out long before this island's malevolence had found him. A strange calm settled over him, the kind that came only when all options had vanished, leaving only the inevitable. The entity didn't want a sacrifice. It wanted him to become the sacrifice, to be bound to the seal, to become a living part of the prison. And he would. But not as its victim. He would become its warden. His grandfather hadn't fled in cowardice. He had sought to understand, to find a way, perhaps even to pass on the burden. The truth, as Dean now understood, was that the seal wasn't merely a physical barrier. It was a conscious prison, a web of ancient energies that needed a mind, a living anchor, to maintain its integrity against the relentless pressure from below. It needed a countersong. He began to trace the symbols etched into the stone around the shaft, following his grandfather's faded diagrams. The air thickened, growing heavy with a scent like decay and forgotten oceans. The deep song swelled, a cacophony of voices from unimaginable depths, pressing in, trying to overwhelm his thoughts, to shatter his resolve. He fought it, focusing on the intricate lines, the precise angles, the specific cadence of the protective chant his grandfather had tried to master. He found his own voice then, raspy and raw but firm. He began to intone the countersong, a series of guttural melodic sounds that felt alien on his tongue, yet resonated deep within his chest. It was not a song of defiance, but of binding, of containment. As the words left his lips, a strange, electric current coursed through him, starting at his fingertips and spreading like wildfire through his limbs, into his very core. It pulsed, responding to his presence, drawing on his consciousness, his will. The deep song recoiled, a shriek of frustrated rage echoing from the shaft below, sharp enough to make his teeth ache. He felt the entity's anger, its vast, unfathomable hunger, but also its momentary impotence. He was not just reinforcing the seal, he was becoming its new conscious component. The cost was immediate, insidious. Memories began to fray at the edges, details of his past life blurring, dissolving like smoke. The faces of those he loved, the warmth of their touch, the sound of their laughter. They became indistinct, distant echoes. His own name felt less like a label and more like a suggestion. He was Dean, but also something more, something less. He was the seal. He didn't know how long he lay there, pressed against the cold stone, the countersong a silent hum within his fractured mind. When he finally stirred, the lighthouse felt different, quieter, The immediate threat was neutralized, not gone, but held at bay at a terrible cost. The sea air, once a comfort, now tasted of salt and the lingering scent of something ancient and terrible. He remembered leaving the island, but the details were hazy, like a half-forgotten dream. He knew he had to leave, to put distance between himself and that place. But the island's influence had already seeped too deeply into him. He carried the burden of the deep song's knowledge, an internal hum that never truly ceased. Eventually, the vessel docked, and he disembarked onto a bustling quay, the sounds and smells of civilization a jarring assault on his senses. He moved with a strange detachment, the world around him seeming both hyper-real and utterly distant. The agent, a man with tired eyes and a neatly pressed uniform, held out a hand for his documents. Dean fumbled in his pocket, producing a water-stained passport. Dean opened his mouth, but the words felt trapped, tangled. How could he articulate the profound truth that had been etched into his very being? He saw the agent's mouth moving, heard the faint echo of his questions, but his mind was elsewhere, listening to the silent, eternal countersong that now resided within him. The world, once so solid and predictable, now felt thin, permeable, a fragile membrane stretched over an unspeakable truth.